Alrighty, the next passage that I'm going to be read is also from the Fires of Vesuvius, Pompeii Lost and Found, also by Mary Beard. I'm starting from page 203 from a heading entitled The Face of Success. We know a good deal more about the men who held office in Pompeii than we do about the day-to-day practicalities of local government. Even in those earlier periods where the electoral posters are lost, and with them the names of the candidates standing for office, we can still work out many cases who the elected doviri and aediles were, and even in which year they held office. It is a delicate business of piecing together a list from the names and dates found, for example in Jucundus's tablets, from inscriptions commemorating those who sponsored building works and gladiatorial shows, and the names and the offices blazoned on tombstones. The end result is that for some decades we know the names of over half the local office holders. During the reigns of Augustus and Tiberius, partly because there was so much building work going on in Pompeii, that figure rises to at least 3/4. Some of these remain just names. Others we can get to know much more intimately. We can see something of their individual achievements and aspirations, and how they chose to be remembered. Just occasionally, we can put a face to a name. These office holders conform to a certain type. Not everyone in Pompeii would have been eligible to stand for election, not even all the free citizens. Assuming that it was organized, like other towns in the Roman world, those who put themselves forward to become aedile or duumvir were formally required to be male, adult, of free citizen birth, respectable, and rich. This means, for example, that no ex-slave could hold public office at this level. A slave granted his freedom by a Roman citizen became a citizen himself, and could vote in elections, a strategy of incorporation almost without parallel among other slave-owning societies. But it was only in the next generation, for their sons were under no such restriction, that the family of an ex-slave could begin to play a completely free part in local government. It also means that the poor were not merely discouraged from standing for office by its various obligations, for how could they have afforded the entrance fee and the required benefactions? They were also formally prevented from doing so by a minimum property qualification. In other towns, 100,000 sesterces worth was a common minimum. There were also rules which excluded a variety of unsuitable professions, such as actors, and laid down the minimum age for office. At Pompeii, no one under 25 or perhaps 30 were allowed to be an aedile. There was still room, however, for plenty of variety among the office holders at Pompeii, from those who must only have just reached the property qualifications to men of very considerable means, from the local-handed aristocracy to the newly rich. Aulus Umbricius Scaurus' family, as we have seen, had recently made their money out of garum. Caius Julius Polybius has a name which hints that his family was descended from a slave in the emperor's household. Others, like Marcus Holconius Rufus, whom we shall shortly meet face to face, belonged to a family prominent in Pompeii for generations, and whose wealth derived mostly from its land. Generations of scholars have looked for a pattern in these variations. Can we, for example, spot periods when the nouveau riches became more prominent? After the earthquake, perhaps? Despite an enormous amount of work and ingenuity, the only safe conclusion is an unsurprising one. Some old families were prominent in the town's hierarchy from the early 1st century BCE until the eruption. Throughout this period, members of newer families often gained public office, making up around 50% of aediles and doviri, but they seem rarely to have gained a permanent foothold in the elite. A mixed society, in other words, but one where the old money always counted. Just occasionally we find an interloper, when one of the doviri came from outside the local community. This may have broken the rules for local residents, but in these cases that would have hardly been a worry, for the office holder concerned was the emperor himself or an imperial prince. Caligula was twice duumvir of Pompeii, once in 34 CE in the reign of Tiberius, when, for what it's worth, he must have also been considerably below the minimum age required for the office, and once as an emperor 6 years later. In fact, when Caligula was assassinated in January 41 CE, he was halfway through his term of office as duumvir quinquennalis of Pompeii. There seems to have been no illusion that would have been undertaken any practical duties of the duumvirate, for on each occasion we find an additional prefect with judicial power in office, acting, as is explicitly stated in one inscription, on the emperor's behalf. This office of prefect proved a useful standby on other occasions too. Experienced men, obviously deemed a safe pair of hands, were appointed as prefectae, following the riot in the amphitheater and after the earthquake of 62, to take the lead in the emergency. How exactly would Caligula's duumvirate have been arranged? And where would the initiative have come from? The imperial palace or Pompeii itself? One theory is that by inserting an emperor or prince into the local government, even in an honorary capacity, the central authorities in Rome were attempting to gain some control of affairs in the town. It was, in other words, a punishment, or a rescue bid after some crisis in the town's management. Hard as it is to imagine the mad Caligula ever being more of help than a hindrance, maybe even a nominal imperial presence would make scrutiny and central government intervention easier. But more likely an imperial name among the Doviri would be considered an honor for the town, and the initiative would have come from the Pompeian side. Caligula's agreement to accept the office would have been the result of careful negotiation between Pompey and palace officials, not unlike, I imagine, the delicate protocols that lie behind securing the visit of a British minor royal to a school fete. Honor was also at stake in some extraordinary appointments to the town council. One young lad, Numerius Poppatus Celsinus, was given a membership of the Ordo without payment at the age of only 6, because he had rebuilt the Temple of Isis at his own expense. Or so the inscription says. Presumably his father, an ex-slave, rebuilt it in his son's name, and so eased the boy's path into an established elite family whose burial ground had been discovered at Scafati. Decimus Lucretius Justus was nominated to the council without charge when he was only 8 years old, and he died at 13. Almost certainly these honorary members did not have full rights within the Ordo. Documents from elsewhere in the Roman world suggest that there may well have been different ranks of counselors, some who would not have had the right to speak in discussion. All the same, a handful of preteens makes a startling addition to our picture of the Ordo. Aediles, Duvori, and counselors were the very top notch of Pompeian society, in wealth, influence, and power. They formed the local ruling class, or the ducurial class as they are often now called, from ducurian meaning counselor. Even so, these local bigwigs fell far behind the rich power brokers of the capital itself. The property qualification of 100,000 sesterces, if that is what it was in Pompeii, is substantial enough to qualify to be a senator at Rome, the very top rank of Roman social hierarchy. In fact, many Roman senators did have their origins in the country towns of Italy, but there is not a single senator whom we know for certain came from Pompeii or a Pompeian family. They might have owned an attractive seaside villa in the neighborhood, but it was not their ancestral home. This is not to say that the citizens of Pompeii were without influence and connections with the world of the capital itself. After all, they had gained Roman citizenship in the Social War, and before the one-man rule established under the first Emperor Augustus effectively stamped out democratic voting in the capital, Pompeians were eligible to vote in Rome, both at elections and in making laws if they could be bothered to travel there, that is. They were mostly enrolled in the same voting group, the Manian tribe, whose name they still included in their formal titles, such as Aulus Umbricius Scaurus, son of Aulus of the Manian tribe, long after the voting had died out. But some of them had closer links to the center of Roman power, as we can see if we look at the career of just one leading Pompeian. He is Marcus Hulconius Rufus, 5 times duumvir and twice quinquennial, who lived in the reign of the Emperor Augustus. Hardly a typical counselor, he was a member of an old family, known for their wine production. He probably counts as the most powerful Pompeian we know, and one who made a major impact in his city. Now in the museum at Naples, the life-size marble statue of Marcus Hulconius Rufus once stood at the crossroads of the Via dell'Abbondanza, in its widest part, almost a little piazza, right outside the Stabian Baths, next to a large arch which spanned the road and may have carried statues of the other members of his family. This is not far from the Forum, where most of the other images of local worthies and imperial grandees stood, erected by grateful or carefully calculating city councils. The emperor and his relations Occupying the most prominent positions in the piazza, the locals are ranged round about so as to not upstage the imperial family. But Holconius Rufus would have stood out by being slightly separate from all the rest. It is probably that his location that accounts for the statue's survival. The Roman salvage operations after the eruption seem to have made a beeline for the statue in the forums, leaving very little to be found by modern archaeologists. The salvagers missed Holconius Rufus, who was standing away from the main group, a little down the street. The statue is a proudly military figure, dressed in elaborate cuirass and cloak, his right hand originally holding a spear. When he was rediscovered in the 1850s, clear signs of paint were still visible. The cloak had once been red, the tunic under the breastplate white with a yellow border, and the shoes black. It is a splendid piece. The only jarring element is the head, which looks somewhat too small to fit. Indeed, it does not fit. The head, as we have it, is a replacement, perhaps for the original damaged in the earthquake of '62. Careful examination shows that it was not originally made for our statues at all. Another portrait head has been recut with the features of Holconius Rufus and inserted into the neck. So whose portraits suffered the indignity of removal and reworking in this ancient version of identity theft? One ingenious idea is that the replacement head had belonged to a statue of the Emperor Caligula and had been surplus to requirements after his assassination in 41. Not only was the city very likely to have commissioned a statue of Caligula given his 2 periods as duumvir, but archaeologists who have closely examined the reworked head think they can detect some telltale traces of Caligula's distinctive hairstyle surviving the otherwise complete makeover. To us, the idea of recycling the head of a disgraced emperor to play the part of Holconius Rufus seems faintly ridiculous. But this practice of changing heads is in fact surprisingly common among the portrait statues of the Roman world. Underneath the statue, still visible on the pedestal outside the Stabian Baths, is an inscription detailing the main offices that he held. There we can see his repeated holdings of the Pompeian duumvirate, but headlined is one called Military Tribune by popular demand. Military Tribune was a well-established post in the Roman army for young men of officer class, but by popular demand. This seems to refer to not to any truly military office, but to an honorary position, awarded by the Emperor Augustus on the recommendation of local communities. Hence, the popular demand. It has brought with it the formal rank of knight, the next rank down from senator. Gratifying to the recipient, no doubt, and useful in other respects for the emperor himself. As the Roman biographer Suetonius writes of this general initiative in his Life of Augustus, his aim was to maintain a proper supply of men of respectable standing, and loyalty too, he might have added. The honor almost certainly involved some contract with the emperor himself, or with those close to him. For the inscription records that Holconius Rufus was also patron of the colony, a semi-official role which might involve intervening on the town's behalf with the powers that be at Rome. The patron might be expected, for example, to help arrange for a prince or an emperor to hold a local duumvirate. Finally, he was priest of Augustus in the town. Even before the first emperor had died, he held a panoply of religious honors, almost as if he were a god, and that was coordinated here in Pompeii by the local Holconius Rufus. Looking back to this statue, we can now see the point of the military guard. There is no reason to suppose that Holconius Rufus had ever been in the army. The elaborate cuirass is a visual reminder of his prestigious but entirely non-combatant military tribunate. For those viewers who knew the monuments of the city of Rome itself, however, there was also a nice, even if slightly over-the-top reference to one of Augustus's most lavish new buildings, the so-called Forum of Augustus. This vast development in the middle of Rome, packed with statues, artworks, and gleaming colored marbles, was focused on the temple of Mars the Avenger, a reminder, if such was needed, that Mars was the god of war, who had brought vengeance on those who had assassinated Augustus's uncle and adoptive father, Julius Caesar. The original statue of the god in the Forum of Augustus has not survived, but from various versions and replicas of it, we can be certain that the designs of Holconius Rufus's cuirass were copies of those on the cuirass of Mars himself. Our Pompeian bigwig, in other words, was here dressed in the image of one of Augustus's divine protectors. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, Augustus is reflected in some of the building work sponsored by Holconius Rufus as duumvir. During his third period of office, we know that he did some renovation in the Temple of Apollo, building upwards. For a surviving inscription, states that he and his colleagues paid... Hold on. I'm gonna turn off that. This is a stupid mistake. Don't mind me just muting my Facebook conversations because I'm too stupid to do so beforehand. Continuing back from we left off, for a surviving inscription states that he and his colleagues paid 3,000 sesterces to the owner of the adjoining property, who had presumably objected, in recompense for blocking his light with a new wall. But later, along with Marcus Holconius Sealer, either brother or son, he funded a much bigger and more costly improvement scheme in the old large theater, originally built in the 2nd century BCE. Inscriptions, again, probably originally placed over the building's main entrances, record that the Holconi built at their own expense the covered gallery, the boxes, and the auditorium. This list does not quite capture for us the impact of the changes. Not only was the number of seats increased, but the refurbished covered gallery effectively became the divider between the new seats on the upper levels and with their own frankly shabby entrance staircase leading up from the outside the building, and the upmarket seats below, which were occupied by the elite male citizens. This was a renovation, in other words, which accorded exactly to the policy of the Emperor Augustus to make sure that spectators in the theater were carefully segregated by rank, a segregation not achieved, as in a world of modern theater, by the price of the seats, but by law. It is no coincidence that as well as further inscriptions honoring Holconius Rufus in the theater, there is also one honoring the Emperor Augustus. This is a good example of how the wishes of the emperor and the changes in policy at the center of the Roman world were transmitted to places like Pompeii through the intermediaries such as Holconius Rufus, with a foot, as it were, in both camps. It also offers a nice hint about how the family success might be achieved down the generations. At least, if Holconius Rufus hoped that his own and Sellers' costly benefactions in the theater might help to guarantee the prestige of the Holconi into the future. He would not have been disappointed. One of these men aiming to become Duumvir in the last elections the town would ever see was Marcus Holconius Priscus, very likely his grandson, or great-grandson. But what about beyond the male elite? It is easy to get the impression from the election posters, the records of benefactions, and the list of Dovirian aediles that it was only the male elite that counted in Pompeii. In some senses, that is formally true. No one without the required wealth could hold one of the main offices, nor could any ex-slave, however rich, nor any woman, no matter how capable or ambitious she was, or how aristocratic from her birth. Yet, there are plenty of hints that other more or less official groups of citizens, from lower down the formal social pecking order, could and did make an impact in the public world of Pompeii. And there is clear evidence of the impact of leading women at the very heart of the town. To return for a moment to the family burial ground recently found outside Pompeii at Scafati, the most distinguished of the family members commemorated, probably called Decimus Lucretius Valens, though the name does not actually survive, was, like Marcus Holconius Rufus, a Roman knight. He had been granted that status by the Emperor Tiberius. He had been the local sponsor of a very generous gladiatorial game, and as we would now expect, in return for this generosity, as the text of the inscription puts it, the local council had decreed him a statue on horseback at public expense, as well as a funeral, though the word itself has been lost, and a burial place and a eulogy. So far, no surprises, but the inscription goes on to record other votes of honor. The Augustales, and possibly some other group, for frustratingly the next word hardly survives, voted him statu pedestres, full-length standing statues, as did the attendants of the Augustales. Along with the Nates and Scabulari, the Forenses, whom we have met before, voted him shields, that is, his portrait on top of a shield. The Nates and Scabulari are more of a puzzle. The best guess is that the Scabulari were the clapper beaters in the theater, assuming that the word is connected with the Latin scabulum, meaning a large foot-operated castanet, often used in pantomime. If so, the Nates might have been the cushion sellers, cushions being a desirable commodity if you were to sit for hours on the hard stone seats. But that is largely a deduction from one attested meaning of the Latin word natus, or nates, that we have, namely, buttocks. But whoever exactly these different groups were, it is clear that there were numerous organizations in town, in addition to the local council, who might not only have an interest in honoring a leading citizen, but also the institutional structure to make and follow through a decision to do so, not to mention the cash to pay for it. As well as those mentioned on Lucretius Valens' memorial, a couple of very fragmentary painted lists, one firmly dated to the 40s BCE, record presidents and attendees, a mixture of slaves, ex-slaves, and freeborn men, in charge of some sort of local association in the city, probably based around the crossroads and shrines often found there. We also find reference elsewhere to the fortunate Augustan suburban country district, which not only had its own officials, but also acted as a benefactor, paying for some of the seating in the theater. Some scholars have assumed that this was mainly a rural voting district, which had developed extra social and institutional functions. But the fact that it seems to have been reorganized in 7 BCE has suggested to others a slightly different role. For this was exactly the same year as the Emperor Augustus reorganized the local neighborhood associations in Rome, turning them partly into loyalty organizations focused on the emperor himself. Was there an influence or initiative from Rome lying behind this fortunate Augustan suburban country district? Certainly. As we shall see in Chapter 9, the religious worship of the Roman emperor in Pompeii involved organized groups of relatively humble city residents. Predictably enough, once we get below the level of Ordo, the evidence is much thinner, and it is even harder to pin down exactly what these groups did or how they were constituted, or just how official they even were. We can guess, for example, that there was some differences in status between the cushion sellers and the forenses, but what exactly? Some were even on the margins of legality. Tacitus explains that one of the Roman government's responses to the riot in the amphitheater was to disband the illegal clubs. Who were these illegal clubs? Murky as these groups are, however, the point is not just that there were organizations in the town which involved those who would have been excluded from the Ordo itself. It is also that they seem to have operated on similar principles to those of the local elite, and with sometimes similar rewards. Benefaction, for example, played an important role at this level too. Whether statue or theater renovation, Pompeii was a culture of giving at all levels. Public office of any sort entailed public generosity. Probably the most important of these groups were the Augustales, one of the associations that voted to honor Decimus Lucretius Valens, and which may have almost amounted to an ordo for ex-slaves. The evidence for this group in Pompeii itself is very fragmentary. We have plenty of evidence for its individual members, but little for what the Augustales as a whole did. Again, our picture must depend on piecing together what we know from other towns in Italy. Their name makes it fairly clear that they were involved in the religious worship of Augustus and other later emperors, but they were not specialized priesthood in any narrow sense. For the most part, we find them engaged in sponsoring banquets and buildings, and even, like the Ordo itself, paying an entrance fee in order to get into the group. The large tomb monuments of some of those commemorated as Augustales in the cemeteries outside Pompeii suggest that they were individuals of wealth and power in the town. One in particular, the memorial to Caius Calventus Quietus, who is almost certainly an ex-slave, boasts that on account of his generosity, he had been awarded by the decision of the council and the agreement of the people a basileum, a special and specially honorific seat in the theater that was awarded to the city's leading men. What the Marcus Hulconius Rufuses of the Pompeian world said about the likes of Caius Calventus Quietus, we cannot know now. But in death, at least, there is nothing to distinguish him from the members of the oldest landed families. Fiercely hierarchical society though it was, the routes to prestige at Pompeii, even for those outside the decurial class, were more varied than they might seem at first glance. But the biggest surprise in this male hierarchical world is to be found in the forum itself. The largest building in the area, standing at the southeast corner, was erected in the reign of Augustus. Its function has long been a cause of controversy. Like so many of the forum buildings, market, slave market, multi-purpose hall, but its inspiration is clear. We have already seen that 2 of the statues on its facade were copied from the Forum of Augustus. The carved marble door frames, decorated with scrolls of acanthus, reflected the contemporary style of the city, and they were very close to those on another celebrated Augustan monument, the Altar of Peace. Some art historians have compared its conception to a huge portico erected in Rome by Augustus's wife, the Empress Livia. That is a good comparison in more ways than one, for this building, known as the Building of Eumachia, was also sponsored by a woman. Inscriptions over the two entrances declared that Eumachia, who was a priestess in the town, and the daughter of one leading family married into another, built it in her own name and that of her son, at her own expense. Her statue stood at one end of the building, paid for by the fullers, hence the fantasy that the whole building might be a clothworker's hall. We know almost nothing about Eumachia, and can only guess at the different circumstances that might lie behind her building of this monument, and the different degrees of active involvement she might have had in the planning and design. Most likely, she was attempting to advance the career of her son. But one thing is certain. The finished product is stamped with her own name, almost as firmly as the theater is stamped with that of Holconius. Eumachia here represents a similar conduit for the culture of the capital to make its way to Pompeii, and Eumachia was not the only such female benefactor. An inscription found in the forum makes it clear that another of the major buildings there was a work of another priestess, one Mamia. We should not, for this reason, overestimate the degree of power held by women in this town. To be a priestess, public office though it was not the same as being a duumvir. Even the large-scale benefaction was a long way from the formal power. That said, Eumachia is another example of the varied routes to public prominence that the town offered. She is another face of success. That is the end of this chapter, passage known as Face of Success. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you're trying to sleep anytime soon, I do hope you fall asleep.